Children learn to recognize racial differences very early in life. Unfortunately, adults' reticence to discuss race leads them to come to their own conclusions, which are often wrong and often harmful. Unfortunately, this is often most salient in white communities where race has become something not talked about. On this episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane Eugene, educator, organizer, and anti-racism trainer Margery Freeman discusses the topic, Raising Anti-Racist Children. This episode originally aired September 22nd, 2021.
Good day, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. Race Talk Revolution is where your voice matters. So we thank you again for joining us this afternoon or morning, wherever you may be. This afternoon, our topic is Hearts and Minds, Raising Anti-Racist Children. Our guest today is educator and anti-racism trainer and organizer, Miss Margery Freeman. Now, as always, during our conversation today, we ask that you please remain muted. Now, when we get to the Q&A section, we will tell you how to raise your hand and all of that. Once again, we want to remind you that Race Talk Revolution is a respectful, inclusive platform, and it's designed to encourage constructive dialogue around tough issues pertaining to racial and social injustice. Race Talk Revolution is a safe and brave space for people of all backgrounds to share ideas and opinions, to explore the nuances of systemic racism, and together we grow our anti-racism muscles. In our Race Talk Revolution community, we practice radically inclusive love. So what that means is, even if we don't understand or agree with what's being shared, we still listen with respect, appreciation, and empathy. You see, it is our commitment that every person be encouraged, be heard, and appreciated. Because on Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, every voice matters. Now, here's my co-host, Reverend Lane Cobb.
Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And welcome to our first timers as well. Very happy to have you all in the house today to hear Ms. Margery Freeman. She has served for over 35 years as an anti-racist organizer and educator, providing training and technical assistance to schools, universities, human service, civic, government, and community-based organizations across the country. Having served on national, regional, state, and local policy boards of educational, faith-based, and human service organizations, Ms. Freeman has addressed diverse audiences and conducted workshops and seminars with dozens of national, regional, and local educational, human services, advocacy, philanthropic, and grassroots organizations. She has helped raise over $2 million in new public and private grants for nonprofit educational organizations and published over 24 articles, pamphlets, and books on early childhood education, adult literacy, and anti-racist education and organizing. Ms. Freeman is a core trainer organizer with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and an educational consultant working with schools, human service organizations, and racial equity groups across the country with a focus on historical impact of racism. She has also served as regional services coordinator for Proliteracy, a national international organization working with a 6-person team to strengthen regional and state adult basic education and literacy organizations. She is has been the executive director of the YMCA Educational Services in New Orleans and child advocacy leader with National Council of Churches and Ecumenical Child Care Network in New York City. Now, when I say that this woman is an educational expert on anti-racist education, that's exactly what you have with you today. Welcome, Ms. Freeman. So happy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Cobb. I appreciate your including me today. It's a real pleasure. And I look out across this audience and I say, man, this is friends and family time. I love it. Thank you very much for being here, all of you all.
You did bring, oh my goodness, you're welcome. It's our pleasure. You did bring a tribe with you today.
I did.
So great to be popular. So, Ms. Freeman, you've been a trainer with the People's Institute for many years leading the Undoing Racism workshop. And you've also done a lot of work as an educator to create programs that promote racial and social equity, including founding a school in North Carolina. So would you please tell us a little bit about your journey? Well, you told me that.
Actually, I think, first of all, people in the room are going to be really confused by the North Carolina reference because it wasn't NC, it was NO, as in
Ah, it's New Orleans.
So
I'm sorry, mea culpa.
I was not the founder. I was one of a group of people who decided that we wanted to develop. It was going to be a public middle school because what we found in New Orleans, this is way back in the 1970s, what we were finding in this community center where we were working is that the children had been pushed out of school. They were hanging out in the community center. And we looked around and said, this is something that's an opportunity for us to bring some new ways of education to young people in New Orleans. My husband, David Billings, was the head of the community center then, and he was the one that found the money for us to be able to begin this school, which was called the Tremé Street Academy.
So tell us how you came to doing the work you do. You've had a lifetime of anti-racist education work. Tell us about how you, what your journey's been like.
All right, I'm glad to do that. Thank you. Well, I started out as a young person in California. I was raised in the Bay Area, and I was raised in a very highly educated family, and a family that I've come affectionately to call the knowing class. We were people who thought we knew everything, and it was really kind of amazing that that was so, but that definitely was so because highly educated, formally educated white people often see themselves as being the ones who have to teach everybody else what to do. So that was the kind of tradition I came out of. And my family were, many of my people were doctors, some of them were ministers, many of them were missionaries. So this was the kind of tradition I came out of. We were the helpers. We were the people who were helping others, what today would be calling the white saviors, but that's more recent. Back in the day, we were just seen as doing good, doing the Lord's work. Anyway, the point of that is that about into my 20s and then into my 30s, I was carrying forward with this tradition. I was becoming a teacher. I was moving to New Orleans, where the community in New Orleans was largely a Black community. And so I started teaching in New Orleans, very traditionally. Like a lot of young white people, I thought that I was really doing a wonderful job, and I was teaching history. I was teaching American history. And then I went to one of these workshops that the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond offer. And what I found, to my absolute chagrin and my anger and my humiliation, was that I didn't know anything. It was kind of amazing to find out after having lived, I guess I was probably 40 something when I finally went to one of the workshops, and I realized I knew nothing. And that was a good start for this anti-racist journey. But really, to just add one more piece, if I might, Reverend Cobb, I really was mentored by so many people in that community, both people who were the founders of the People's Institute, Ron Chisholm and Dr. Jim Dunn. My husband, David Billings, also was a mentor of mine. And so I had people in my life who were saying to me, you don't have to just get angry. You can start doing something about it. You can start becoming an anti-racist. And so my journey started, and the anti-racist journey started in the kind of mid-'80s, and largely associated with the People's Institute at first, but then bringing the organizing skills that I was learning there to a lot of different organizations, many of the ones that you mentioned.
Thank you. And we were so fortunate several months ago to have David Billings on with us and talking about his lifetime of anti-racism work. And wow, I can't imagine the two of you together. I would love to be a fly on the wall when you guys are doing a training together. Do you often train together?
Well, as a matter of fact, we don't get that opportunity very often because what we try to do in anti-racist work, in educational work, whatever kind of work we are, we try to create multiracial teams to do that work. And so when I'm doing the work, I'm often paired up with people who African Americans or Latinx people or whomever, but I don't often work with other white people, which is a loss because we learn from each other. And I had the good fortune really for probably 10 years before I became an actual trainer with the People's Institute. I went to workshop after workshop after workshop after workshop, just studying and listening and reading and trying to learn what was going on and what this meant. And so I had the great opportunity to be with people that were doing this work, Barbara Major, Diana Dunn, and the others that were there, Dan Buford, Michael Washington. These were all some of the fundamental teachers of the People's Institute's way of doing things that I was learning from. And it took me a long, long time to get that confidence and to find my own voice. I think that's really what it has to do with, because sometimes when we're in the presence of people who seem to know everything, then we often step back and say, oh, well, I couldn't do that. I don't think I can do that. But in fact, we can all. And it took me a long time, but I finally sort of found my voice. And now what I'm trying to do with my voice is bring it back so that other people's voices are more dominant. And I love doing that.
Yes, indeed. Yes. So for those of you who don't know, we talk very often about the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. We have had many of their trainers on, and we do promote the Undoing Racism workshop. If you have not taken an Undoing Racism workshop, we will put a link in the chat at the end of today's broadcast, but you can go to pisab.org and find some information there. So you've been affiliated with the Center for the Study of White American Culture for some time also now, and they have a program called Raising Anti-Racist White Children. And so when I saw that, I knew I wanted to invite you to come on. And so thank you for doing that. My question is, who is registering for those programs and what are you telling them? And thank you, Robert Alpern is also here today. You have quite a few people from the Center for the Study of American White Culture with you today. So you all, when question and answer comes, please feel free to chime right in.
And before my colleagues in the center cut my head off, I just have to say that I attended that workshop on raising anti-racist white children. I was not the lead person in it. In fact, the lead people in it are in the room, some of them. So I am very happy that they're here, and I hope that they will correct anything I might have to say. But I learned a lot from that workshop, and it added to the ways in which I was thinking about what this idea of being a parent, being an educator, being a grandparent now, what does that mean? What does it look like? Because I was particularly interested in what is going on in this society where we have a great deal of focus on kids of color, and that's totally appropriate. But what we're missing is we're missing the way in which we're raising white kids in the society to not know who they are. And so I feel so blessed by having been able with David to raise our 3 children, one of whom is in the room. Stella, thank you. Hi. To really understand who they were in this society that is structured around race. And that isn't something very many children get to learn. And particularly white children don't get to learn that. So it seems very, very important. This is such a timely subject, and I'm happy that the Center for the Study of White American Culture is really promoting that workshop. And they have one coming up next month, in fact, starting on October 2nd. It's a 3-week process. I mean, not 3 weeks, 3-session process over 3 Saturdays. So I'm going to urge anybody who wants to go to that because it's really excellent. And I learned a lot from it.
So what is the process would you say? Raising anti-racist white children, right? There's a dilemma that you shared with us when we spoke last week about when children begin to learn about history of the United States, they start to articulate perhaps that white is bad. And that is not, that's not the message that we want to have them sit with. And people are concerned a little bit, well, I don't want my kids to be called racist. We don't want our children to think that their heritage is a bad heritage. Where's the balance? Because somewhere in there we need to talk. And I know there's a resistance generally among white people to speak about racism, and particularly in terms of how do we talk to our kids about it? Because kids have questions. They pick up these nuances of racism very early. What's the process?
Well, I wish I could be in a circle with half of the people in the room that I know, because they all have some of these answers, but I'll do my best. First of all, I think what we need to recognize, and this is something that is not known in the kind of general culture or the general society, children start to recognize difference when they're babies. When they're little tiny babies, they start to see differences. And by the time they're about 3-year-old, they are starting to attribute value to the differences. So that when we say we don't want to hurt children by talking about racism, they're already making their own decisions, their own conclusions, their own assumptions. So to not intervene, to not have conversations means, for example, if you're walking in a mall, back in the pre-COVID days, you're walking down the street with your child who's 6 years old, and it's in a community that's a mostly white community, and somebody in the mall passes by who happens to be a Black person, and the child who's 5 or 6 says, "Oh, look, Mommy, what's wrong with her skin?" Because they are so surprised to see somebody who's not white. And the mom or the dad or the parent is not equipped to answer that. And so what we have is we have parents saying, "Shh, don't talk about it." That's what we do. We do it out of our good faith. We think we're doing the right thing. But the child, of course, has reached a wonderful conclusion. Oh, I see. There's something wrong with that person. That person must be dirty. Or that person must be bad. That's the conclusion that children draw if we don't talk about it. So talking about racism is absolutely essential. We have to know how to do that. And that's what's the dilemma. And I just want to say one thing about why we don't know about it, or why we don't know how to talk about racism. It's because for the last 70 years in this country, ever since the civil rights movement worked to finally declare that racial prejudice was no longer legal. It had been legal. It had been completely overt, normal, legal for 365 years in this country. And then we passed laws because of all the incredible work that was done by so many people over so many generations. We finally passed laws that said it was no longer legal to discriminate on the basis of race. Well, the trouble with the laws is that it did not. The culture said nothing changed. So that what we ended up with is people coming to realize that they wanted to practice something that we called colorblind. Since it was no longer legal to discriminate on the basis of race, we're just going to declare that it doesn't exist. It's an amazing thing. It was sort of like a tour de force of the people who were in charge of this country to make sure that when we started to talk about race anymore, the only people who were going to be allowed to talk about race were those terrible, terrible, awful white supremacists over there in the corner. We wanted to get as far away from them as we could. Or this small handful of people, both the communities of color, who have always talked about race and continue to do that. But in the white world, we were silenced. We were told if you talk about race, it's bad. So for 70 years, that's 3-4 generations now, We have not been allowed to talk about race and racism until very, very, very recently. And so I think that has made it very hard for us. Those of us who are white don't know how to have this conversation. My colleague Maria Reina Pumarejo calls it, she says, we don't have the facility, we don't have the language to talk about race and racism. And so what we have to find is that voice. And we can't do that without intentionality, without being intentional about it. And that's where I think this idea, how do we do it? How do we talk with our children? And I want to just say one more thing, if I might, which is that in our household, our children were all raised talking about race all the time. It was normal. It's what we did. It was just so normal that nobody sort of felt they had to dip their voice down when they said the word black. You hear that still. You hear people not being able to say words that relate to race. They don't say white, they don't say black because they're scared. And that's because we've been told that it is a bad thing to do. And so in our family, we talked about it all the time. And the point that I'm making about that is that our children really did grow up understanding themselves as white people in a white society, a society that was biased in favor of us who are white. And so that has stood them in good stead. And I see them raising their own children in such a way that those children too are finding that they can ask questions, they can have conversations, they can become curious. And that's what we want for all our children. All of our children need to be able to be curious and have the freedom to ask questions and to study and to do what they need to do in order to be able to understand this thing of race.
So, Margery, I have a quick question, and thank you so very much. And there's something that you just said, right, where, for many years, the nation as a whole has been afraid to talk about race, but now that's beginning to change. Now, this could be a no-brainer, right? But I want to ask the question: what do you think has made that shift? Why do you feel that the nation as a whole is beginning to make the shift of wanting to talk or needing to talk about race?
That's a wonderful question, Reverend Holden. Thank you for that, because it is recent. It really is recent. Even during the period of time during the civil rights movement, when many, many white people were involved with that movement, but we were seeing it as something where we were helping those people. We were helping other people get their rights. And that's good. That's wonderful. And we should be doing that. But what we've done, I think, really I guess I would say the last 10 or 20 years, we've begun to turn the mirror around. Those of us who are white have begun to look at ourselves and look at who we are, look at whose we are, which is rare for us because many times this is a very ahistorical, I would almost say anti-historical society. We don't want to know about the past. You'll hear people, very often you'll hear people when the topic of race comes up, people will say, well, my family never owned any slaves, or that was a long time ago, or didn't we have a black president? We hear all of that stuff. And I think that maybe, I can't tell you when, I don't think there's a particular time, maybe some of the folks in the room do have a sense of that. But I think it's just been in the last, really in this 21st century, that those of us who are white are starting to say, my goodness, I got to figure this out for myself. It matters to me. It matters to my family, because we get alienated from our parents. We get alienated from our children and grandchildren. And all of the things that we've been told, you did it on your own. You got everything you deserve. All those myths that we were taught as a country, as white people, that we did this all by ourselves. We're suddenly realizing that it's not working for us anymore. It isn't working for us, so we have to figure it out. We're getting very rattled about that. We're trying to figure out, what do we do? And I think that's where the conversation has begun.
Yeah, thank you.
Something else that you said was that, white people can stand being called anything but racist, right? It's like the supreme dirty word, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I just would like you to, what did you mean when you said that?
Well, I mean, I think that it was certainly the experience that I had, and it's the experience that most of us who are white have had, that it's almost a trump card for a person of color to call a white person racist. It's going to stop the conversation. It's going to end that moment. It's a trump card. And the reason it's a trump card is because being called racist is being equated with the people who attack the Capitol. It's being equated with people who burn crosses. It's being equated with people who are these incredible, violent people who've had horrible experiences of shooting up large churches and schools and theaters and all of the things that we know about. And so that's what it's equated with. And what we would say is that we have to get past that, don't we? We've got to get past this idea that being called a racist is the worst thing in the world. Part of me would say, I don't usually say this out loud to people when I'm first talking with them, but the truth of the matter is, in a country like ours, how could we not be? How could we not be prejudiced in every conceivable way? All of us, people of color as well as white people, are all full of prejudices that we've been taught for generations. And so being called a racist, just is, we got to get over it. That's what I guess I'm saying. We got to get over it because we've got to get to work. Those of us who are white, if we're going to make a difference in the lives of our children and our grandchildren.
Well, I think that people are still equating, as you said, racism with, a few bad apples, like it's just people that are out there and those particular people are racist and they're causing all the problems, for really not understanding that racism is a system. It's an ism. It is in everything. This is one of the things I love about the Undoing Racism workshop, really getting people to understand this is systemic and it sets white people up for failure as well as people of color for failure, right? How do we get white people to understand that they have skin in the game? And how do we get people to talk about the historical setup that we find ourselves in?
That's really important. It's a wonderful question. And I think it's the one that's really should be dominating our conversations. Those of us who understand ourselves as anti-racist people and organizers, that should be one of the dominant things. And I just want to reference, I recently read the book by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us,
Wonderful.
where she's an economist. And her idea is that we've been bamboozled in this country into thinking that this is the myth of the zero sum, the myth that if they get something, I lose. That win-lose way of approaching our lives is really, really getting in the way of those of us who are white, because it was taught to us. That's what's been taught to us, this myth of scarcity, this myth that I've got to hold on as tight as I can, because otherwise they're going to come and take my stuff. And what we have got to realize is that's been a message that's been deliberately given to us over the last 70 years. You have people way back, you'll recall, none of you know this probably from your own lives, but really, if you think about it, way back when Ronald Reagan said that myth of the welfare queen, y'all remember the welfare queen? She was a Black woman who was using my tax dollars and going and buying things she didn't deserve and all this kind of stuff, driving a big Cadillac. I mean, it was amazing. It was a remarkable myth. But what it did is it racialized the whole notion of who didn't have anything, who was poor. So we said, oh my God, it's all those Black people who are poor, and they're going to try to come and get our stuff. And that myth of zero sum, that myth of scarcity, that myth of if they get something, we lose, has been perpetuated now for generations, so that the notion, for example, of giving people what was the phrase that Johnson used? Help me out, somebody. The phrase that he used where you have to give somebody a leg up, if you will, because there has been such discrimination. But those of us who are white saw that leg up as they're getting something they don't deserve. And part of that is because we don't know our history. We do not know our own history. We don't know that every law written in this country, practically since the beginning of the 17th century until the present, well, at least until the 1960s, was written to benefit me and people who look like me. And when I say that, it's shocking. What do you mean? I did it all on my own. I made everything. Nobody ever gave me nothing. Well, if we don't know what was done for us, then we are very shocked to find out that in fact we didn't do it on our own. And I often stipulate, if you will, that everybody worked hard. White people worked hard, Black people worked hard, but they didn't get paid at all. Indigenous people worked hard, and they were killed. Latin people worked hard, they're still working hard. Asian American people worked hard. But that's not the point. The point is that those of us who are white, because we're white, that's all. Just because we happen to be designated white by law, we've been given things that others have not had. And that history is not taught. And consequently, we get very confused, we get very upset, we get very angry. We say, I'm not going to listen to this. We walk away because we can.
So, how can we keep internalized racial superiority from getting into the bones of our white kids? You know, how do we keep white supremacy from just swallowing them up?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize it, don't we? And most of us, I mean, internalized racial, we call it, in the People's Institute and other organizations call it internalized racial oppression, because it's the messages that we've received for generations, the messages that say to those people of color, say that you're less than, you're minority, you're inferior, all that messaging. Even to people who say, I don't feel that way, I don't think that way, doesn't even matter. You've received the messages anyway. And for those of us who are white, there's no way that this whole society hasn't told us over generations that we are better than, that we are superior, that we are supposed to be in charge, that we're supposed to have the big jobs because we're more intelligent. I mean, that has been a myth of this country since its founding. It's very effective, and it's still with us. So what we have to do, what I often say is that internalized racial superiority that those of us who are white have received and taken in, we can't just say, oh, I don't feel that way, and have it disappear. 98% of what we take in is unconscious. So we first of all have to recognize that we are all being played by these messages of the culture, all of us, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. It's sort of like, I often say it's like our cultural DNA. It's there. We cannot get rid of it. We can become conscious of it, begin to understand where it comes from, and begin to recognize it when it shows up, and acknowledge it when it shows up. It happens all the time to me. I say to myself, oh my God, Margery, you've been doing this so long, you shouldn't be making those mistakes. Well, no, of course I make mistakes. How could I not? How could I not? So we have to be kind to ourselves, perhaps, in order to be able to do this. And I think one of the things that gets in the way, and this is a manifestation, if you will, of that internalized racial superiority, is that we think we have to be perfect. We think we have to be better than everybody else. And consequently, we're constantly competing with other anti-racist white people, for example. I'm the better anti-racist white person. Oh, she made a mistake. She said something wrong. He's so this, he's so that. We do that all the time. White people invented cancel culture. That is our MO, if you will. If somebody makes a mistake, we write them off. We can't do that. We're going to really get to the place where we're going to have an understanding of how we've been damaged and really dehumanized by this thing of racism. We've got to learn to love each other in the white community. We've got to learn to love people that we don't particularly like, because we can't throw people away. That's the mantra of the People's Institute. We can't throw people away. It's hard. It's hard work. And some of us who are white would rather be beaten with a stick than have to go and talk with our parents or our children or our friends about racism. We've got to learn how to do it. We've got to do it because that's what the children are waiting for.
I love that. You know, someone, I think Lemaine put something in about people saying that we can't talk about race because when you talk about race, that's what points out the differences and that's what is divisive. And it's like so exactly just the opposite, right? It's like talking about what's real and what's true for all of us is what brings us together. You know, it's a truism. This is amazing. Eugene, do you have, what do you say?
I say again, to go along with you, this is amazing. I have another question before we open it up to Q&A, right? Well, maybe we'll wait for that towards the end. Yeah. Well, let me preface it. No, let me go ahead and drop the seed, and then we'll bring it back towards the end. So, Margery, what do you want people? What do you want us to talk about? And we're going to come back to this question, but what do you want us to take away from this conversation? You know, what kind of things do you want us to start to think about in healing this thing called systemic racism in our lifetime?
Well, I think we have to be humble. I think that we've got to figure out how to start. I'm telling this to myself. How do we ask questions rather than telling people? I've spent most of my life just lecturing people. You know, I go into a family reunion and I'm the one that's got my finger out. That is not useful. That is not useful at all. And what we find is that when we walk into a room of other friends or family that are not doing this work of anti-racism, you know, they roll their eyes. They, oh God, here comes the PC police. And it doesn't work. And I'm an organizer. I'm an anti-racist organizer. So I think it's important that how we do what we do matters. And we've got to find our way into that kind of genuine, organic conversation with people so that we're asking questions instead of lecturing. That's not easy for me, I can tell you, because as I said, I grew up in the knowing class. I'm supposed to tell everybody things. But I think that if I could say that from my experience, that asking questions has been so profitable, so useful, and has enabled me. Let me tell one quick story. I just have to do this because I love to lift up my brother, not David Billings, he's my husband. My brother's name also was David. His name was David Freeman. And I say was because he died 2 years ago. But he was a man he had great wealth, great, you know, all this. And I have been doing this work organizing among white people, including my family, my mother, my sisters, my children. I was so proud of myself. And I would often say in passing, oh, yes, all my family have been to an Undoing Racism workshop, as if that was normal. It's not normal. But what I didn't say is that I had never broached the subject with my brother. I had written him off in advance. I had said, he'll never get it. he's just one of the masters of the universe. He's not going to get it. But this is what happened. And I have to tell this because it's a very important story to me, and it'll be important maybe as a lesson for some of us. One day I was visiting him with my other sisters in Philadelphia. We were having just a siblings gathering. It was really a nice time. This was only about 3 years ago. And my brother turned to me and he said, Margery, tell me about that work that you do. What is it called? Undoing something? And I said, yeah, undoing racism. And he leaned in and he said, tell me a little bit about what you do. Well, I was shocked, first of all. And then I said, okay. So I got out my little soapbox, got up on it and started telling about what we do and all of that. And he leaned in further and he said, really? That's really very interesting. Do you ever do that work that you're talking about in my community in Philadelphia? And I lied. I said, well, yeah, sometimes, but I haven't done it, which is not true. I had done it in Philadelphia, but not invited. But I was ashamed. I was embarrassed and ashamed. And he said, well, listen, I'll tell you what. If you ever do this work in the neighborhood, please let me know. I'd really like to come to one of those undoing racism workshops. He never had a chance because he died the next year. I always tear up when I say that because he was in his late 80s and I had written him off. I'm already in my 80s myself, but back then I'd written him off. He's too old, too rich, too smart, too this, too that, to get it. What an opportunity lost. And that's what I think our messages have got to be with one another. We've got to be able to listen, ask questions, and love one another into this work.
Yeah. Thank you for that story. And I'm glad you had mentioned just then, we have to listen because we were talking about, having the courage, to ask the questions, and being humble enough, which takes courage, right? It takes courage to let go of that ego. It takes courage to humble yourself, to ask questions, but also to be courageous enough and open enough to listen, to really listen to what's being said. There's one thing to hear something, but are we really listening to what's being said? Yeah. And then be willing to make that change. Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, this is good. This is good. So let's open it up now for Q&A. So real fast, just if you want to ask a question, you want to raise your hand, take your cursor, go down to the reactions button, which is on the far right. Click on your reactions button and you see the bar there that says raise hand. I keep a list of who's next and all that good stuff. If you don't see the reactions button or that raise hand button is not in that reactions tab, go to participants, which is second from the left. Go to participants, scroll down until you find your name, click on the little 3 dots on the right-hand side, and then you should find it there, the raise hand option there. In your Q&A, okay, Margery, I see your hand, but in the Q&A, we want to also be mindful of keeping the question/comment down to a minute or less, because we're going to have people who want to ask questions and we want to have time for them to ask their questions, but we also want to give Margery time to answer the question. Yes, Margery, I saw you raise your hand.
The only thing I was saying is that I don't read the chat while I'm having a conversation, so I don't know what's been said in the chat.
That's okay.
And I apologize for that.
Nope, that's why we're here. Okay. Oh man, people have got up here. Let's say, I'm gonna go where we have Vicky, then we have Seja, then Serena, and then Cody. Yeah. So Vicky, then Seja.
Thank you for this opportunity. Margery, I'm sure you're aware of the school systems that are, banning CRT and critical race theory, things like that. I am running for school committee. And one of the fears of the people that I talk with is that I'm going to be one of those people that are forcing that on the schools. And I wondered if you had a good response, maybe I could give people about CRT.
That's a wonderful question, Vicki, and I wish that I had the right answer or an answer. I think that we're in the midst of a really, this is so much like in the 1950s. Everybody who was criticizing the common way of being was called communist. It's a really difficult time. And I'm so happy that you're running for the school board. That's really excellent. I think that what you have to do is you just have to come out of your own story. That's, I think, how we have to do it. We just have to tell our own stories. How did I get to this? Why is it interesting to me? Just be real. And being real doesn't mean lecturing. Being real doesn't mean critiquing CRT. That's not the point. I mean, that's just a boogaboo. That's just that, you know, it's over there as a scare tactic. And it doesn't have, there's some wonderful resources out there to help us with that whole conversation, but I don't think we should be drawn into that. I think we should pivot away from that and just tell our stories about why we feel for your, you know, maybe you tell about whatever's going on with your children so that you make it human. That's what I would do.
Thank you. Seja.
Well, hi. My question has to do somewhat with the schools as well. A few years ago, the schools in Michigan, the school board for the state decided to go through rewriting textbooks, and they were leaving out huge sections of history or minimizing it, or I don't even know how to describe it, but they did go around to each region and have hearings in each district or each area. And I think without exception, those were so well attended by parents, teachers, and others, and I'm one of the kind of others because my kids were grown, who just railed against the fact. And a big point that was made was that the school books are primarily published in Texas. And I want to know, what is the solution for solving this problem so that complete history is taught that neither overstates nor understates what our real history is? Well,
you've asked an important question. My very quick answer is organize, 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 organize. And that's what I mean by that is that we cannot stand by and let that happen. We've got to find our way into our different small local communities. We have to talk with our neighbors, talk with our friends, all those people who were incensed by what you are describing. Have to find our ways back into the conversation together and not be intimidated by the media or what other people might be saying about how awful it is that these people are trying to brainwash our kids. All of that baloney is, we've got to find our way. We've got to get clear about what we know about history. Also, we have to become students of history in order to not be able to be so taken in by this whole effort to continue to take away. Our history has always been written from a very, very narrow perspective. And so it's just really hard. We have got to organize together to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Serena Pittman, Miss Ruthie.
Hi, yeah, it's Serena, and I hope you can hear me. My Wi-Fi is acting up. I wanted to share a quick story. In my family, I'm blessed to live in a diverse community, Saginaw County, Michigan. And I was taught a story that happened in the 1940s with my anti-racist grandmother. The first time my aunt ever saw a child that was African-American was on a city bus. And there was a little girl who was by herself and everybody else on the bus was white. And it was the first time my aunt had ever seen a Black child. And my aunt said, "What's wrong with that little girl?" And my grandmother, I miss her so much, she passed away 20 years ago at the age of 91. What she said, and she said it loud enough for everyone to hear. And it goes back to what we were talking about last week about God, the idea of God being an artist, which is what I was taught by my grandmother. She said to my aunt, "There's absolutely nothing wrong with that little girl. God made that little girl exactly the way he wanted to make her, just like God made you the way in which he wanted to make you. God is an artist and expresses his love and creativity in whatever way he wants to. We're both children of God. And I'm just so grateful that for my grandmother and for my mom and for the community that I live in.
Thank you, Serena.
That's a wonderful story, Serena. Thank you for that. And people can answer in different, I think sometimes what we do when we get faced with that is we ask the question of the child, oh, I think, what do you see, you know, and just begin a conversation.
Yeah. Cody Kirkman.
Yes, I was raised in a totally the opposite environment. and child of the 60s, but even way early on, I decided that this wasn't the viewpoint I wanted to have. And the being better than concept was upsetting. Yes, all of that. I think it's important to be proactive rather than just sitting back. On the other hand, we ended up adopting a son from a Mayan from Guatemala, and had two interesting reactions to that. And one was from a Guatemalan housekeeper that we had who was very upset that he was Mayan, because within her culture, she was, had green eyes and fair skin. And how could we, it was fine to adopt a Guatemalan baby, but dark one? No, so it's so entangled. And then the opposite reaction we got was, oh, that's so nice of you. And that tended to be from the white community to adopt. Yeah. And yet it hasn't been easy for him at all. Which we didn't realize. We went in thinking, highest malnutrition rate in the Western world at that point and all this, and we were helping, and yet it's been very hard for him. So couldn't you speak to that a little bit? I don't know how, but thanks.
Well, you've said a lot, and I appreciate your story, Cody. I think that the only thing I would say is that racism has been the United States' biggest export. And we have managed to infect most of the world with our ideas around the idea of white being the better way of being. So that the whole idea, even in communities of color, that lighter is better, or being closer to white is better. And people coming from other countries are often told indirectly, if not directly, oh, stay away from those African Americans, stay away from those Black people if you want to succeed. All of that has just been taught to all of us. All of us are implicated in that. And so when we have children that we're bringing from other cultures and other communities, we have to find ways to be really clear about what they're facing and what's going on with them, and then get help so that we don't have them out there thinking that they're white kids when they're in fact being treated as kids of color, as you know, I'm sure. But very often we use the colorblind approach to raising kids of color in white families, which doesn't help prepare those children at all for this society, does it?
Yeah. The first time I heard somebody talk about their reaction to the phrase that somebody said to her, that they don't see color, her response to them was, well, then you don't see me. Right? Yeah. And what a wonderful way we have all been created in all these different shades and colors. And here we are dealing with this that continues to try to separate that. Cody, thank you so very much. Brother Joe.
Thank you, Eugene. First of all, Margery, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and your experience with us. I have one question for you. I'd be very interested in learning what your advice is to people that look like me for volunteering opportunities and getting to spend more time and with people of color and learning of their experiences. I'd just be very curious what you think are some of the best opportunities for that type of volunteerism.
Well, Joe, we've been volunteering in the communities of color for about 500 years. So one of the things we have to recognize is that even though you may be coming in as a well-intentioned individual, you can be seen as a collective. And that's very important for us to recognize about ourselves. And I think that I would say the first thing that we have to do before we go to any communities of color is just to learn more about ourselves. To learn more about what is it like to be white in this society? What does it mean to be white in this society? What has it done for me? What does it hurt? How has it hurt me? And then being able to honestly be able to come into a community and say, speak about being, we can sometimes, we speak in these very universal ways sometimes. And I find myself trying to say, for example, in a community of color saying, as a white woman, I often think blah, 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 blah. And prefacing what I have to say, my declarative sentences with, as a white person or as a white person, I think this or I think that. Because I think what that does is it signals to people of color that we might possibly know who we are. By and large, we don't. By and large, those of us who are white are very uneasy and uncomfortable talking about our whiteness. I think we've got to become comfortable with that. We've got to learn how to talk about being white. What does it mean? And then when we're in a community it's a mixed community, that's a community with white people and people of color, we can talk out of our own truth. We can talk out of our own experience. And it'll lead us to places that are more authentic, it seems to me. I know that in the Center for the Study of White American Culture, the whole idea of, learning how to put whiteness into a proper perspective so that it's not always centered. And we have to figure that out. We have to figure out what to do. When you or I walk into a room that's full of people of color, we suddenly become the center of that. Not because we should or because the other people in the room think we are, but because the culture around us tells us that our power, our value is more than anybody else in the room. It's rarely said, but it's a very crucial way of our missing each other when we're trying to go into communities that are not white. Go into those communities thinking that we're going to just be Joe. We're not. We're going to be Legion white man. And that's where we have to start in our conversations, I think, with ourselves and with others. That makes sense?
Thank you, Joe. Vicky Smith.
Oh, I wasn't raising my hand. I was doing a thumbs up.
Oh, that was a
Does
thumbs
that
up.
make sense?
But
Like,
yeah,
that makes
yes.
sense.
Thank you. Is there anyone else?
I'd like
Hi, this
to.
is
Oh, no, please.
this is Tyrone, man.
Tyrone, hang on. So we're going to go to Tyrone and then Christine Gray. I saw you raise your hand like that. So Tyrone and then Christine. Go ahead, T.
Okay, just a comment that I wanted to make. Someone said to me one time, superiority is inferiority whistling in the dark. And you kind of remind me of our speaker when she's speaking to it. Knowing yourself is more important than anything else. I remember in the 60s and the 70s, we spent a lot of time talking about Black awareness. So we had to tune into who we were. We had to look at neo-colonialism. We had to look at a number of things. Now it's time for white folks to do the same. It's not about them coming in and trying to understand Black people better. It's about them understanding themselves better. So I couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate you speaking that truth. I'm done.
Thank you,
And just to mention, Tyrone, I think that you're absolutely right. And I think not only do we have to know who we are and where we are, we have to really understand the structural arrangement of this racism. We have to understand that it's giving us benefits every minute of every day. I walk out the door of my apartment and I walk into somebody's store or somebody's bank or somebody's school, and I'm going to be given the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to be treated as a nice, well-meaning white person. And that is something we have to interrogate. We have to recognize that every one of the systems around us is still treating us as the best. We're the best people. We're the ones that should be running things. So we've got to figure out, what does that look like in our
And I'm
own.
glad, I'm sorry, excuse me. I was going to say, I'm glad you really said that, because the thing that bugs me a lot is that people, instead of looking at who they are and where they're coming from, they go to the human default. Well, we're all human, or the natural experience of white people is considered a human experience. And one way it is, certainly because we all are humans, but to equate whiteness with being human, that's kind of scary. And so anyway, I wanted to speak to that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyrone. We have Christine and then Sarah.
So first, I want to just thank you for everything that you've shared, and say that over the last 20 years in the work that I've been doing with my husband, that I've learned a lot of these lessons, often not in an easy way at all. There have been many challenges and confrontations and humblings and all of that. And still in all, even with all that learning, I found that I can stumble, and I want to express how incredibly painful it can be when you do stumble. I have a good friend that I inadvertently said something in a way that she experienced as racist, and it led to an intense battle between us, me saying I didn't mean it and her saying how dare you speak that way, and we got through it, and we're as close as we ever were. But oh my gosh, for a while I thought we never would. It was so hard. And I don't know if you have any suggestions or about, I think that is one of the reasons, honestly, why we do also sort of tread carefully to avoid that kind of thing happening inadvertently as well. So anyway, that was an experience that I had, and it was a deeply painful experience for both of us.
Indeed, and I think, Christine, your point is important, which is that we're going to be making these mistakes all the time. And one of the problems with the mistakes that those of us who are white often make is that they land very, very difficult, with really harsh, hurtful ways on the person of color, the people of color that we're speaking about or to or from. And it doesn't matter whether we meant it. It really doesn't. It's not about the intent. It's about the results. And we have to really cope with that. We have to get stronger about that. We've got to just say, yeah. I mean, it's awful to make mistakes. It's awful to be called out as racist. I hate it. I hate it. And yet, if it weren't for the people calling me out, I probably wouldn't even be on this journey right now.
Yeah. Also, if I may add, Christine, the fact that you guys had the courage, as uncomfortable as it was, to have the courage to talk through it, to cry through it, to fight through it, and as you said, you're closer now than you were before. And I believe that comes from, having the courage to have that conversation. Yeah. And that's what it's all about, right? When Lainey and I talk about your voice matters, you hear us say it a lot, and it's because that's the truth, right? Our voice matters. And so it is about having the conversation. And again, the other part about communication is having the wherewithal, the courage, the ability to open up and listen with the heart, and that takes courage, because my heart doesn't want to be hurt, right? Yeah, but it's so worth it to feel the love that we can have for each other. Mm-hmm. Good stuff.
Could I just say something in response to that, which is what
Sure.
it shook us both, I think, so badly. And just hearing and so we've been actually, both of us, I think, careful with each other since. But maybe now would be a good time to go back and talk about it when things are calm and we've been, good with each other for about a year since. But perhaps we should go back and talk about that moment.
That may not be a bad idea to do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christine. Sarah.
Thank you for your talk. My question really builds very much on what Christine said. In our church community right now, I mean, I tried to be on this journey of self-understanding, realizing there are many oopsies and ouchies along the way. I've been reading, I've been attending race talks, so I'm not totally naive in this, but I know I make a lot of mistakes. But we're in a church community where our leaders are they're well-intentioned, but maybe a little less aware. And right now, a situation exists where there's a real lack of trust between the African-American members of our church and the white leadership, such that the African-American response has been to withdraw. They don't want to engage in conversation. On the one hand, they're saying, our voice needs to be heard. On the other hand, we're saying, we've been hurt too badly, we don't want to speak anymore. And it's a really difficult situation to be in because, I know that our pastor means well, but I think he's had rather little, he speaks the language of anti-racism, but I'm not sure how much he's really examined this unconscious, what comes out. I had a very painful individual experience that I've been working through with one parishioner. And we were able to have a good conversation, and I think we're working it through. But for the most part, they just shut up. They don't want to talk. There's no trust. I don't know how we move forward. For better or worse, I've accepted the chairmanship of our Racial Justice Committee, so I really want to know what to do. Thank you.
Multiracial settings are exhausting for people of color. And so we have to just recognize that I can't even imagine how difficult it is. But I do think that our distinction between, as I said earlier, the distinction between our well-meaningness and our actions and our actual, what's the results. We often, those of us who are white, we're in white institutions, whether it's a church or a school or an organization, will say, oh, why don't we have more Black people in the organization? Why won't they stay? We keep wishing that they would stay instead of interrogating ourselves and trying to figure out what's going on. And that interrogation is hard work. It doesn't just happen by saying, I really didn't mean to be so this or that, whatever it is. So it's not an easy thing. And I think in multiracial settings are always fraught. They have 500 years behind them. They're always fraught.
Yeah. Thank you.
Because my children are multiracial, and I know that some of them are exhausted with this. Some of them are trying to work it through. But
yeah,
it's difficult. It's difficult. It's really difficult.
But not impossible.
Thank you, Jean.
We have Lemaine.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. This has really been wonderful, and I definitely want to re-listen. It occurs to me that when we as white people really confront our long history of systemic racism and possibly personal racism, that there can be this deep shame. And I think that some of what I see is this resistance to shame, because shame is so painful to feel. What are your thoughts on that? And how do we speak to people to not generate shame in them and close them off?
That's a really good question, Lemaine. I think that I'm often referencing and speaking about, many of you know the work of Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of death and dying. And one of the things, if you'll remember, the first stage of that is usually what? It's usually denial, right? And then we go to the next stage. What is that next stage? It's often shame or guilt or feelings that are very uncomfortable feelings. And then we go through a stage of bargaining. We sort of say, well, you know, I may be racist, but they are too. Everybody's racist. You know, we'll sort of bargain around that. We go through a lot of other things. We go through anger. And finally, we get to acceptance, but it isn't a linear journey. And I think that shame doesn't really help us in this journey. And we have to find our way to recognize it and to find our way through it so we can get to those places where we can actually do some things for ourselves and for our communities that are going to be sustainable. If we stay with shame, then we will not become anti-racists. We will find it too painful. And so we will leave the work. We will leave the movement. And we'll say, I just got too upset. I got too full of shame or too angry. And what will happen to those of us who leave this movement is we will be welcomed back to our families and our friends and our places of work where they say, oh, thank goodness you're off of that race kick. And so we've got to figure out how to stay intentionally engaged, even when we feel shame, and work our way through those different things so that we can finally be effective to do some work that'll make a difference.
And as a corollary, how can we encourage other people to not get stuck in shame, but to, you know, look at our country and be willing to do that work?
Well, I'm not a therapist, but I do know that what we have to do is we have to say our own story, tell our own story. I know how you feel because I felt that way too, and I found that if I did this, that I did that. I think it's the feel, felt, found approach to our work that's being empathetic, if you will.
Feel, felt, found. Good stuff there. Thank you, Lemaine. We go to Kay Whitefire Felkner.
Hey there, let me find my note up here because I wrote out what I wanted to say, but basically it was, thank you so much for saying that part about walking out the door, because I swear I will never walk out the door the same after you said that. Because I am so often looking out there at what is out there instead of right here in front of me. And if I look in front of me, I can speak to my experience. And when I speak to my experience, people listen. And also the importance of listening, asking questions, sometimes shutting up and asking questions. So thank you. I so appreciate that. I swear I will never be the same walking out the door. I mean, it was just a gentle slap in the head, you know, it was like, boop, okay. Or more like this, third eye.
One of those VA moments.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You know, there's this old saying in terms of listening, right? The reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth is so that we can listen twice as much as we talk. Listening is such a beautiful art. We go to Terry, and then we go back to Seja, and then back to Tyrone. Repeat questioners. Terry? Did you find your mute button there? There you go.
Can you hear me now?
You got it.
Okay, well, since this is about children, I thought I would share this story about an incident that occurred when I was about 7. I don't know if you can tell with the lighting here, but I am white. My parents immigrated from Hungary, and I have very curly hair, although less so at my age now. But when I was a child, it was very short, and you could call it almost kinky. And this happened in the summer when I was a very deep tan, and I was about 7 and old enough that in my little community in Nassau County, Long Island, my parents would let me ride my bicycle a very short distance in this area of sidewalks and field in the middle of the 3 schools. So I was riding around and I heard a male voice shout the N-word. So I looked around. I guess I knew enough to know what that meant. And I looked around to see where this person was, and I didn't see anybody. And I heard it again. And then it finally dawned on me that the person being referred to was me. And of course, this was rather astonishing and hurtful. But the point that just occurred to me as a result of the discussions today was that, to the best of my recollection, I never mentioned this to my parents, which is kind of remarkable and kind of ties in with the shame we were talking about, and this, that at a young age, which is, you know, such a sort of watershed moment, that still I wouldn't mention it to them.
Yes, we're very silenced, absolutely silenced, and breaking that silence is one of our biggest challenges.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Seja, and then we'll have Tyrone Cozy as the last one for the questions.
Yeah, I was feeling back into the previous sessions that you've done. I think I started with race talk back in July, and you had a presenter who talked about carrying a notebook and writing down when she noticed biases in her own thinking or speech, but even before something that maybe was unsaid, even that she noticed as a bias or something that made her uncomfortable. And it seemed like that technique would be really useful, maybe with each other in resolving a friendship, like Christine, I think, was talking about, or in a group where you might pair up with other people, you know, pair up the room and then sit with a particular person and then sit down and make notes about one incident where you felt that way, and then come back and ask why. And then when you get the answer to that, ask why again, and then ask why again. I believe it's called the Toyota method, but anyway, do it about yourself, and they do it silently about themselves, writing it down on a sheet of paper, and then verbally afterwards exchange that without any comment or judgment.
That's an interesting theory, an interesting process to go through. You're reminding me, Seja, of how reluctant those of us who are white are to talk with one another about our foibles and our thoughts and our attitudes and our decision making. We're very uncomfortable about it because we recognize someplace in our heart of hearts that we have really made decisions that have privileged us. And we recognize that those are decisions that we've been able to make because of being white. And so we basically try to ignore it. So I think keeping that notebook is probably a really good place to start.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. Tyrone, and then I know I said that Tyrone was the last one, but I got to have Mr. or Mrs. Cobb ask the last question.
I was going to say, brother, you better have that. I got nothing but mad love for the Cobbs.
Right.
So Margery, I want to go back to something that you had said about shame. And I think that that's really, really an important point. Yeah. And also something you said about being kind to yourself. And I think one of the biggest problems we all, as human beings, when we look at something about shame, something that we think that we could have done, that we think is so horrific, that is really hard for the psyche to buy into. It's really hard to buy into that without going down in a dungeon and beating yourself up, right? You know, so the beauty of what you said to me is that push through the shame by being kind to yourself, by knowing that, yes, you may feel this way. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means that this is what you've been programmed with. This is your experience. So part of you has to accept that part of you that is racist, you know, without necessarily having to beat yourself up or, you know, all that stuff, because racism is a broad definition. I mean, you know, Lane is really good.
Is that any better? I don't think so.
Stress that word out, you know, where and what it really means. So I just think that that's an important. We got to push through it by being kind to yourself, because if you don't, and that's true with anything, right? Black people can be upset at Black people. They could be pissed at themselves, how they view other Black people. You still got to be able to be kind to yourself, because that's part of the human condition, I think. So just want to throw that in.
Thanks, Tyrone. All righty. Mr. and Mrs. Cobb.
Well, hello, this is Jim Cobb speaking, and I have a question generally for the subject of race talk, really, and I don't want to identify myself as a naive optimist, but I wonder if we see a shift in the culture, a positive shift in the culture taking place in America. At 88, I have born in segregationist North Carolina, Jim Crow North Carolina. I have seen huge steps in the right direction. And I remember a book that I read about 10, 15 years old, 15 years ago by Eugene Robinson called Disintegration, in which he was sort of optimistic about the destiny of America. And he said, there is a higher percentage of interracial marriages than there's ever been. And I've seen the future in America, and it is brown. And I happen to believe that so much progress starts at the bottom in social integration. And I see advertising of featuring integrated couples that you didn't see this 20 years ago. I remember when the first one showed up about 15 years ago and the reaction that it got. Now they're all over TV, okay? And it is not only in the Northeast, it is up and down the East Coast, and I don't know where else it is in America. So I wonder, I'm looking for your comment about this evidence of progress, or do you see it as an evidence of progress, as I do? It even shows up on Fox News. I watch that 5 minutes a month. So, all right. Okay, that's my question, my comment. All right.
And obviously you must be kin to this lady that's running this show, am I right?
Okay, I beg your pardon?
Yes, this is her dad.
I figured it was. I just wanted to make sure that we knew who was in the room. That's important. Thank you for being here. But I want to just say that those of us who do anti-racist organizing, we have this belief that you've got to be positive, that you've got to have hope, that you've got to be optimistic. If we were not optimistic, we wouldn't be doing this work.
That's right.
If we were not optimistic and didn't have hope, then we would just go put our heads under a stone someplace and forget about it. The whole point of this work, and this is why history is so crucial, that what we know from history is that there have been awful things that have happened to many, many thousands and millions of people over generations. And that what we find is that people keep on finding and being in touch with their own humanity and getting together. And that's what we have to keep focused on. The people who are the most oppressed by racism, in fact, to me, are the inspiration for my work. Because why? After hundreds of years of being eliminated, being decimated, being enslaved, would you continue to be positive and have children and continue to look forward? my God, that is the most beautiful sense of possibility. And those of us who are white have got to get a hold of that sense of optimism also. We're the ones that have got to find our way to our children and say, this is good stuff. We are going to be working on this together. We've got to do this collectively. We cannot do it as individuals. The recipe for failure, the recipe for cynicism is thinking that you have to do it by yourself. We've got to find in the white community, we've got to figure out how to be collective as people of color have been forever, because you know you won't survive unless you are. And so we have to find that same truth out about ourselves and become really careful and loving each other so that we can continue to do this work together.
Do you see the culture changing? Do you feel it?
I think that there has been some wonderful cultural shifts, absolutely. I think that the structural arrangement of this country remains resolutely white supremacist. The institutions still function. That's why all the outcomes from every institution, whether you're talking education or healthcare or life expanse, all of them show white people on top and black people at the bottom. That's how they were set up. And so we've got to get to those systems. And the only way we can get to those systems, if we believe that, well, they were set up by us, so we can unset them. In the People's Institute language, it was done so it can be undone. And that's our belief and that's our hope. And we have got to do it together. We can't do this individually. It's too much. But if we continue to work together, I think we'll be able to do it.
Thank you so much. One more question, and that's from me, Margery. What would you say would be our call to action as a Race Talk Revolution community family? What is your suggestion for a call to action?
I think we have to find our way to talking with other people all the time. We have to study. We have to become scholars. We have to become organizers. And organizers are people who bring others together for a purpose. That's what an organizer does, whether it's in the streets or whether it's in our institutions, whether it's in our family or our home. We bring people together. And if we can get clarity about what our purpose is, what our values are, what matters. The People's Institute has a series of principles, and all of those principles inform us in all that we do. And that's what we have to do. We have to organize together, and we have to continue to talk with one another. We have to continue to learn with one another. And I think I want to say again that if anybody's interested in attending that Center for the Study of White American Cultures workshop that starts on the 2nd of October, it's that racism, raising anti-racist white children. It's really good. And there's lots of resources out there. There's libraries of resources. There's lots of films. There's lots of videotapes. There's lots of talk shows, lots of resources. We just have to go and be disciplined about it and not get discouraged. We have to be positive and optimistic and continue to have hope.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for all of you who have asked questions today as well. And thank you all for being here on this beautiful episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. But before you go, there is a couple of things we want to talk about. So for those of you who are interested in finding out more about the programs available at the Center for the Study of White American Culture, they have, as you can hear, they have quite a lot to offer, and you can visit them. And Lane has put this in the chat once before, but it's www.cswac.org, www.cswac.org. And then for those of you who are interested in learning more about CRT, the YMCA of Greenwich is offering a free learning opportunity this evening, at 7 p.m. It is on Zoom, so you can tune in from anywhere. And it's called Dispelling Myths, Critical Race Theory and Talking About Racism. Lane, are you going to put that link in the chat?
That is in there. Yep, I just put that in there.
Thank you very much. And then here's Lane talking about next week.
Yeah, so please do join us next week. Thank you all who just came for the first time to hear Margery Freeman. Thank you for this absolutely inspiring presentation this afternoon. This was an inspiring conversation. And I hope you all will join us again. Next week, will be our last episode of this 8-week series of Race Talk. Our guest will be Ms. Noelle Casey. We've already done 8 weeks. I know. It went like lightning. But that's what happens when you bring good people together with good energy to talk about important stuff. That's what happens. So we're going to be talking about prison abolition. She works for an organization called RAP, which stands for Releasing Aging People from Prison. She's going to speak about the rising numbers of folks over 50 in the prisons in this country and the role of race in the parole process. So please join us for that organization, and please visit us at racetalkrevolution.com. Our donation button is now active. We thank you in advance for your generosity. Lots of people have been asking about donations. Thank you so much. Your donations ensure that we will continue to be able to provide you with great opportunities like this to grow and learn together so that we can impact our world. And please don't forget to like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube page. And that's my commercial. But let me just say this. If you're somebody who wants to get out there and you're not really sure how you want to do that yet, you need to call on us. We're here to help you. Eugene and I will be happy to speak to you personally. We will come to speak to your group, your congregation, your community, your family. We are here as a resource, and for you to begin to use your voice, because your voice matters, because you inspire the world when you talk about what you are living through right now, what you believe, and what you are inspired to do. So, Eugene.
And just real fast, Robin, yes, this is recorded. For those of you who are here today knew that this is always recorded. And so you will get a link to that recording.
And you can just find us on YouTube at Race Talk Revolution.
Yes. All righty. Thank you so very much, everybody. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Margery, thank you.
Here. Thank you all for being here.
Absolutely. We'll have you back again, right? You're not going to be a stranger.
Come back and just hang out. Come back and hang out. You don't have to speak. Come back and hang out.
Thank you, Tyrone.
And our love to David.
Yes.
Take care. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Have a great week.